McMaster University resides on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The territory was subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. With today's national competition, pediatric residents will be speaking from the traditional lands of several Indigenous people, representing several treaties, land agreements, and unceded lands across Canada. I ask that we pause to strive to acknowledge these respective lands and the First Nation peoples that have always inhabited this country, and to recognize that significant disparities, such as access to potable water, exist within some of our closest communities. As researchers and pediatricians, our organization acknowledges the Truth and Reconciliation Committee's call to action, particularly item 18. We ask that we recognize and work to alleviate the inequities in Indigenous child health, which are the direct result of past and ongoing colonial practices. In collaboration with and under the leadership of Indigenous people across Canada, we will work to advocate in the spirit of reconciliation to eradicate these disparities. We have had an amazing week of pediatric resident research presentations. The breadth and innovative research is reflective of truly dedicated and bright young pediatric resident researchers. It's been a tough go, I think, for all the judges, and today I don't think is going to be any easier. I'd like to recognize the supervisors who have supported these residents, as well as members of the National Pediatric Resident Research Network, who continue to advocate for pediatric resident research across our country. This week's success can be attributed to two wonderful women, Andrea Rudy and Christine Oriel, who work at MyCERN. I'd also like to extend my thanks to my colleagues, Dr. John McGavick and Dr. Joan Robinson, for their dedication and leadership. It's always fun to work with these two. Today, we have a number of judges who have volunteered to participate and promote pediatric research across Canada, and I thank you for your time and expertise. Dr. John McGavick is from the University of Manitoba. Dr. Michelle Batiche is from McMaster University. Dr. Mike Friedberg is from the University of Toronto and the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. And Dr. Catherine Pound from the University of Ottawa, Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. Thank you, guys. I'm just going to go through some quick housekeeping items. Presentations are 10 minutes duration, followed by 5 minutes of questions. We ask that the judges and audience members type their questions into the chat box, raise their hands, or interrupt. Any variation of that is acceptable, as we've done that all week. At the end of the presentations, we'll have a 5-minute break while the judges tally the scores and select today's winner of the national competition. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm looking forward to another day of exciting work. I'm going to ask Nicholas Conradi to present his work and share his screen.
Sounds good. Now, I'm a terrible millennial and often have technical difficulties, but I hope this works. Are you able to see my screen? Yes, wonderful. So folks, my name is Dr. Nick Conradi. I'm a junior pediatric resident at the University of Alberta, and I'm also a PhD student through the Department of Pediatrics at the U of A, working under Dr. Michael Hawks. And the central focus of my PhD is looking at the implementation of a solar-powered oxygen delivery system in some of the lowest resource centers around the world. And today, I'd like to showcase one of our first kicks at the can that looked at the reduction in mortality amongst children with hypoxemia after the introduction of our solar oxygen system in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And right off the bat, I want to say a big thank you, obviously, to Dr. Michael Hawks, as well as Claude, one of our collaborators as well. So to jump right into things, the Solar Oxygen Project stems out of kind of two fundamental issues. First and foremost being the significant burden of disease posed by pneumonia, which causes more than 800,000 deaths worldwide amongst children under the age of 5 years old. And as we know, pneumonia is an infection of the lungs, which causes impaired oxygen absorption into the bloodstream and causes hypoxemia, or low blood oxygen concentration. And hypoxemia is itself a risk factor for, unfortunately, mortality amongst children. And so one might imagine that what do? We give them oxygen. Unfortunately, the availability of oxygen is varies significantly around the world. And some of you may be familiar with the traditional oxygen cylinders, which in some areas are difficult to fill in one location and transport to distant locations where they rattle around, bang, crack, and become inefficient and leak. Or peripheral sites often use oxygen concentrators that rely on the availability of an electrical grid. And if there are power outages, they rely on gasoline-powered oxygen generators that then run out of fuel and thus, unfortunately, aren't able to power the systems. And so it's the burden of disease and the availability of oxygen that provides the foundation for a lot of the work that we do. So Dr. Hawks has developed a fairly innovative and simple system to wrap your head around. So it's a solar panel attached to the roof of one of these health facilities that then powers a bank of batteries that then provides electricity to an oxygen concentrator that's able to extract air from around in the environment and sweep it for medical grade oxygen that's delivered directly to two children. In this case, we're able to use to have two children in each system. And here are some of the photos of the system in action. But the question is does the system work? The proof's in the pudding. And so our objective here was to be able to compare the mortality amongst children and infants admitted to a hospital with acute hypoxemic respiratory illness in 2 centers in the Democratic Republic of the Congo before and after the implementation of solar oxygen. And we hypothesized that the installation of solar oxygen would be associated with a decreased mortality amongst these children. So to give you an idea of kind of where we are in the world, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is located in Central Africa, and the city that we were working in was called Butembo, and it's in the northeast corner of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, bordering the country of Uganda. And it's worth noting that, unfortunately, the Congo is subject to recurrent pandemics or endemics, pardon me, of Ebola, and is also the site of ongoing armed internal conflict. So as you'll see throughout the project, Dr. Hawks has a knack for being able to implement these systems in some of the most hard to reach areas around the world. And then the study itself is also a fairly simple design. So it's called a quasi-experimental before-after design. We have 2 time periods, before the implementation of solar oxygen and after the implementation of solar oxygen. In the pre-solar oxygen period, children would be admitted to hospital, one of these 2 hospitals, and found to have hypoxemia on pulse oximetry with an oxygen saturation of less than 92%. And then they receive standard of care. We'd collect clinical and demographic data and measure their outcomes at the end of their stay. Then between May and October in 2018, we installed solar oxygen and then did the same thing in the post-implementation period, this time having children being admitted to pediatric wards with solar oxygen present on the wards, again, measuring outcomes at the end. Now, the outcomes we're particularly interested in was mortality at 30 days after admission. And we also collected a variety of secondary outcomes, including in-hospital mortality, length of stay, duration of oxygen therapy, and interestingly, the frequency of interruptions to oxygen therapy, which I'll circle back to at the end of the presentation. We're very happy to report that at the end of the day, 30-day mortality amongst hypoxemic infants and children was 60% in the pre-solar oxygen period and was 30% in the post-oxygen solar oxygen period. And that was statistically significant. And those numbers represent a relative risk reduction of 50% and a number needed to treat of 3.3, which is an impressive number. I have here for you a survival curve. So on the X or the horizontal axis, you can see the time since admission in days. On the Y-axis, we have the percent of patients surviving. And we have 2 curves for you. The lighter gray curve at the top is the post-solar oxygen survival, and the darker line in the middle is the pre-solar oxygen survival. And what we can see is that pre-solar oxygen survival is consistently lower than the post-solar oxygen survival. And then that's reflective in the hazard ratio of 0.39 that we found. That was, again, found to be statistically significant. And at the very bottom of the screen, we have here the numbers at risk. I can circle back to that at the end if anyone has any questions for all the biostats nerds. And in terms of, we have some impressive numbers to date. And so it's important for us to understand, to contextualize these results in the presence of confounding variables. And so what we have, I have here for you is one of the models we created that looks at the severity of illness using what's called the respiratory index of severity in children, which is an aggregate score that takes into account a variety of factors like chest indrawing, the degree of hypoxemia, and those kinds of things, as well as the incidence of the primary diagnosis, whether it's pneumonia, sepsis, or malaria, et cetera. And what we found was that indeed, in the presence of these possibly confounding variables, the adjusted odds ratio was still statistically significant and showed a significant benefit in the lower mortality, in the post-implementation period. And then in terms of our secondary outcomes, we also found that there was a statistically lower in-hospital mortality, as well as, and this might speak to the mechanism by which the association with lower mortality in the post-implementation period happened. We found that there were fewer interruptions to oxygen therapy in the post-implementation period, and that was kind of in two different ways. Firstly, in the pre-oxygen period, whenever there would be a power outage, a lot of these centers would have to kick on a gasoline powered generator, and they'd run out of fuel. And once you run out of fuel, you can't power the system and children don't receive oxygen. Similarly, and perhaps more worryingly, when in the pre-oxygen period, when a sick child would be admitted to the pediatric ward, we'd see that oftentimes oxygen would be removed from one child and given to the sicker child in order to triage kind of limited resources. Because our system was able to deliver oxygen to two patients at the same time, that was less of an issue in the post-implementation period. So some interesting findings there. Obviously, as with any study, it's very important to understand the limitations of the study. First and foremost is the fact that there are some important confounding effects of time that have to be taken into account. Those include things like the seasonal variation in the prevalence of disease. Next is the fact that the study doesn't have a parallel arm where you would see a set of hospitals that wouldn't receive solar oxygen installed at all, and similarly, there's a small sample size. So we had 50 children in the pre-implementation and 50 children in the post-implementation periods. So despite these limitations, we're very happy to be able to conclude that the implementation of solar oxygen systems was associated with a markedly lower mortality amongst children under the age of 5 admitted with hypoxemia in 2 resource-limited hospitals. Now, I use the word associated very importantly because in the presence of the limitations that I mentioned and the fact that the study doesn't integrate things like randomization, more investigation is required to be able to understand the true mortality benefit of solar oxygen. And so it's for that reason that we have ongoing a stepped wedge cluster randomized control trial ongoing in Uganda in 20 hospital sites. Despite the fact that more study is needed, it's still important to understand the implications of this research. First and foremost, in being able to reduce the burden of disease amongst children with respiratory illness in some of the hardest to reach areas. Secondly, is the ability to be able to improve the equitable access of resources to technologies and resources amongst some of the most difficult to reach populations in the world. And lastly, I'd be remiss to say if we are in a global pandemic and we're seeing the implications of inequity and poor availability of oxygen in local centers, most notably in India, ongoing. And so being able to have systems that are able to provide what's called surge capacity is an important and exciting opportunity. I'd like to thank our funders, first and foremost, the Rotary International that funded the Butembo study itself, as well as Women's and Children's Health Research Institute at the University of Alberta and Grand Challenges Canada, who fund the larger rollout of the solar oxygen project. And thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mark, for presenting such an interesting and innovative research. I'm going to open this up to the judges to ask questions.
Maybe I can start, Lucy.
Present her work and share her slides.
Okay, hopefully everyone's able to see that and able to hear me okay. Please let me know if you're not able to. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Haley Barutis, and I'm a PGY3 from Western University. And thank you again very much for the opportunity to present our research project entitled Reduced to My Race Once Again, which is a qualitative study which really assesses perceptions around underrepresented minority or URM students admitted to medical school in North America. So a racially diverse medical school cohort has numerous advantages, and most importantly, it introduces valuable perspectives that accelerate advances both in medical and public health research and clinical care. However, for many decades, medical schools have really failed to matriculate student bodies that reflect the racial diversity of the general population. One way that medical schools have tried to increase the diversity of their med school cohorts is by actively recruiting applicants through what we call underrepresented minority streams. And these are optional application streams specifically for students who identify with racial or ethnic backgrounds that are underrepresented in medicine. So in Canada, this most commonly includes Black and Indigenous applicants, but in the US, it extends to Mexican Americans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and mainland Puerto Ricans. And although each stream is unique, the common goal is to reduce barriers for racialized minority applicants, meanwhile nurturing an inclusive environment. So just for the remainder of the presentation, I'll be using the term URM to refer to underrepresented minority students and non-URM to refer to non-underrepresented minorities. So while research shows that URM students and URM streams really help to promote the diversity in medical schools, URM students still report through questionnaires and surveys that they experience overt and passive marginalization throughout their training. And it's really unclear if this is related to how matriculants from URM streams are perceived by their peers. So as such, we aim to use online medical discussion forums to explore perceptions of URM streams across North America to really understand the perceptions of URM streams from the eyes of both URM and non-URM applicants. And with this, we aim to better understand both the conscious and unconscious biases facing matriculants admitted through these streams. So with the knowledge that marginalization does exist, we hypothesized that there would be misconceptions regarding the quality of URM applicants, and this study took an explorative approach to identify what those misconceptions are. So online medical discussion forums are publicly accessible forums that contain various conversational discussions known as threads. And each thread features either a question or a statement regarding a medical topic, and commenters reply to the thread in text form, creating a spontaneous narrative, as you can see on the screen. So really, we chose to analyze threads on pre-med online discussion forums as both their conversational and anonymous nature reduce social response bias. So this means that posters will respond more likely with their honest opinion instead of really conforming to what they feel would be viewed as a socially acceptable response. And as Pre-Med 101 and Student Doctor Network are the most widely used medical discussion forums by students in Canada and the United States respectively, we chose to search for relevant threads in each of these forums. So initially, we completed a preliminary scan of relevant threads from 2015 to 2020 in both forums to identify a set of keywords. And from here, I then performed an initial search, searching each of these keywords, both in Pre-Med 101 and Student Doctor Network, to identify all threads related to perceptions of URM streams. An identical search was then performed by 2 other researchers to ensure that all of the relevant threads were identified. So a total of 13 discussion threads, including 840 posts, were included in the analysis. And most of these posts were posted by anonymous posters, though some did identify themselves as being URM versus non-URM, and some even did state their level of training. So each selected thread's data was then imported into a software called NVivo, and a process called inductive content analysis was performed. And this involved analyzing the content of each post line by line and then providing a code to represent the essence of the text. And to reduce confirmation bias, this was performed by both myself and another researcher, and then our codes were then compared. So the final codes from all of the threads were then refined and published into a final codebook from which a thematic analysis was performed independently by myself and then also by 5 other researchers. And all of those identified themes were then reviewed during a final consensus meeting. So based on our analysis of the codes, we identified 4 overarching themes with 11 sub-themes. And while I wish I had time to discuss all of these in detail, I'll concentrate on the most prominent and the most widely debated sub-themes of them all. So the first theme that emerged was the impact of diversity in medicine, which acted as an umbrella to 4 sub-themes. And the most compelling results really originated from discussions surrounding URM-positioned competence and quality. So throughout the threads, URM students were deemed to be more culturally competent by both URM and non-URM applicants. And interestingly, as the quote reads, non-URM students specifically recognize that having classmates with different perspectives and experiences really promotes learning and better prepares students to serve others better in the future. In contrast to this, several posters did raise concerns that the academic performance of URM medical students is inferior to non-URMs. And as quoted, they felt that URM applicants are held to significantly lower standards than white and Asian specifically. And specifically, they questioned their suitability to undergo the rigors of medical training. And interestingly, their inferior academic performance was perceived to be linked to a lower quality of secondary and post-secondary education, and also beliefs that URM application streams have lower MCAT and GPA cutoffs. Throughout the threads, there was also much discussion surrounding equity in the admissions process and consistency of application requirements, which led to applicants in particular feeling that the admissions process is broken, which is theme number 2. And this discussion of a broken admissions process really linked in closely with theme 3, where applicants discuss socioeconomic status both as a primary barrier to admissions and also its relationship to minority status. So many posters felt that being of lower socioeconomic status disadvantaged them greatly in the admissions process. And interestingly, they felt that this was often underappreciated by admissions officers. Specific reference was made to the difficulties affording MCAT resources, the MCAT itself, and even obtaining a competitive GPA while balancing work to financially support themselves and their families. And in summary, while these posters recognize that URM streams help to relieve some of the barriers faced by URM candidates in the admissions process, they really felt that the barrier of lower socioeconomic status should be considered equally, if not more highly, than URM status. And the final theme highlighted in our study was the consequences of racial bias. And this was an umbrella to 3 different subthemes, with the most pertinent results stemming from the fear of social change. It was clear throughout both of the forums that both URM and non-URM applicants really feared social change, but for different reasons. So non-URM applicants feared that the use of these URM streams would threaten their own acceptance to medical school, and they worried that admitting more URM students would result in fewer seats for non-URM candidates. In contrast to this, URM candidates really feared that they would be perceived as less worthy or less academically capable than other candidates because they were admitted through a URM stream. And they also feared that this marginalization would continue throughout med school and that both faculty and educator implicit biases would negatively impact both their grades and their clerkship scores. And this is represented quite nicely in a quote by a poster from Student Doctor Network, which reads, "And yet, I know next year once I apply, others will think the only reason or main reason I can get in is being a URM. And likely that preconception will later affect how I'm treated. And that gets tiring because at the end of the day, I'm reduced to my race once again." So our study highlighted important perceptions of URM streams, which may affect an applicant's motivation to apply through these themes and also influence how they're treated once they're actually admitted. So having a better understanding of these misconceptions is obviously absolutely vital because it allows actionable measures to be taken at the pre-med level and beyond to help reduce marginalization and ultimately increase the diversity of our workforce. So for example, to combat the misconception that URM students are of lower quality, medical schools could highlight specific outstanding academic achievements of their URM students. And they could also highlight that a more diverse class promotes cultural competency of all of their students. Additionally, so the existence of financial aid and special admissions programs that support students of lower socioeconomic status could also be promoted. And lastly, while there's been an increase in education surrounding equity, diversity, and inclusion in medical school and residency, our study highlights that this needs to be started earlier, specifically at the pre-med level, to both combat this implicit bias and also to reduce that fear of social change. Because we used online discussion forums to collect our data, there is a risk that our study predominantly captured opinions of the most vocal individuals, making it susceptible to selection bias. And because of this, our findings may not actually represent the opinions of the general community. However, we did try to minimize this by choosing the 2 most widely used discussion forums in Canada and the US to capture the greatest number of opinions. And we also chose to use forums where the posts are organized chronologically instead of in order of popularity, which is often seen in other social media sites such as Twitter and Reddit. So as researchers, we hypothesized that we would identify some misconceptions surrounding URM streams, which of course introduces the risk of confirmation bias. To minimize bias in interpreting the data, we co-coded the data, so that was performed by both myself and another researcher. And we also introduced triangulation into the thematic analysis. So this meant that 3 researchers who weren't involved in the initial data collection assisted in the thematic analysis process. And lastly, because Pre-Med 101 and Student Doctor Network are both pre-medical student forums, the opinions of current medical students and graduates were not assessed in our study. And of course, their opinions may differ from pre-medical students and should therefore be a focus of future research. So in conclusion, online discussion forums are a novel platform to provide insight into perceptions surrounding URM medical admission streams. We highlight prominent misconceptions surrounding URM streams, specifically centered around the quality of matriculants and about a flawed and increasingly competitive admissions process. Our results highlight the need for more actionable measures to be taken specifically at that pre-med level to dismiss these misconceptions and ultimately increase diversity in medicine and prevent URM medical students from feeling reduced to their race once again. And finally, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Kirpalani for supervising me on this project, as well as Dr. Wang, Dr. Issel, Marcy, and Albert for helping with the coding, the thematic analysis, and the preparation of the manuscript. Thank you.
Thanks, Haley, for using such a novel approach to qualitative research to address the important issue of equity, diversity, and inclusiveness for medical school applications. I'll ask is Jean-Baptiste Roberge, and he is from l'Université de Montréal. Jean-Baptiste, would you like to share your slides?
Yes, are you able to see it?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So hi everybody, it's a pleasure to present to you the results of my research project, which puts in relation 2 growth monitoring measures in infancy and cardiometabolic outcomes in late childhood, that is at age 8 to 10 years. The 2 growth monitoring measures are body mass index and weight for length. So as you said, I'm Jean-Baptiste Roberge. I'm a 3rd-year pediatric student at St. Justine University Hospital Center. I do not have any conflict of interest to declare, and I propose that we start with some background information. So it is pretty clear in the literature that overweight and obesity in infancy lead to overweight in childhood, then in adolescence, and then in adulthood. And the problem with that is that obesity comes with a lot of comorbidities that can happen and do happen in pediatric years. So those are metabolic syndrome, NASH, PCOS, obstructive sleep apnea, mental health issues, etc. So this suggests that identifying at-risk patients the earliest possible is beneficial so that we can implement early intervention. We actually use 2 different longitudinal monitoring tools based on age to identify overweight and obesity. So both the Canadian and American guidelines recommend using weight for length for infants less than 2 years. However, they also recommend switching to body mass index as soon as the child is 2 years old. So the dual use of both these growth monitoring tools led me to one question. Could we use a single growth monitoring tool from 0 to 18 years old? Well, the World Health Organization actually developed BMI growth standards for infants less than 2 years that have been validated and that may offer advantages over weight for length. And the most important of these advantages is that BMI is expressed for age. It's called BMI for age, contrary to weight for length, which is pretty much a dot on a curve of weight and length. So BMI being expressed for age permits a more intuitive longitudinal follow-up of growth, and it also can be adjusted for gestational age. Weight for length cannot. Also, BMI seems to be a more stable metric over infancy compared to weight for length. It is also well known that weight for length and BMI in infancy are associated with later cardiometabolic outcomes. However, which tool has greater predictive capacity is yet to be determined. So that led me to 2 objectives to my study. First, confirm whether weight for length and BMI in infancy are associated with cardiometabolic outcomes at 8 to 10 years of age. And second, determine whether one of the 2 growth monitoring measures is better at predicting these later outcomes. So let's dive into the methods. We used, as for participants, we used the quality cohort, which is a longitudinal cohort of 630 Caucasian children ages 8 to 10 years. These children have a family history of obesity, so that puts them at risk of obesity themselves. We then, of course, looked at exposures and outcomes. So in terms of exposures in infancy, we looked at the weight for length and BMI at 6, 12, and 18 months of age. And we had the actual measures of weight and length from the health and vaccination booklets issued from the Ministry of Health here in Quebec. We actually use the Z scores of weight for length and BMI because they are easier to use in research, but also because the World Health Organization developed BMI Z scores and not simply BMI. Patients were excluded if they were preterm or postterm, if they were from twin pregnancies, or if they had no anthropometric data at birth and at 6, 12, or 18 months of age. So that led us with a final N of 464 participants. We then looked at the outcomes, which were measured at 8 to 10 years, and they were of two categories. First, adiposity, and then cardiometabolic. So in adiposity, we had BMI Z score, waist circumference, all at 8 to 10 years, then dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, so DEXA, total percent body fat, and then the same technology, DEXA, android to gynoid ratio, which is a ratio which helps us to look more into the abdominal fat. And then in terms of cardiometabolic outcomes, we looked at lipid profile, blood pressure Z score, and then insulin dynamics with a 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test. So we looked at the Matsuda insulin sensitivity index, as well as the insulin secretion derived from the area under the curve of insulin to glucose. And then in terms of statistical analyses, we estimated the associations between exposures and outcomes using multivariable linear regressions. We then looked at the effect size of these associations by calculating the eta squared. And finally, we looked at the agreement of predictions between both BMI and weight for length and the cardiometabolic outcomes in late childhood by calculating the Linz concordance correlation coefficient, which is a coefficient which compares the association between exposures and outcomes with the perfect diagonal y equals x. And it ranges from -1 to +1, -1 meaning no agreement at all, and +1 meaning a perfect agreement. We then, of course, had adjustment variables for child sex, age, and pubertal stage, weight category at birth, so small, appropriate, or large for gestational age, breastfeeding status, parental education and household income, maternal weight at 16 to 20 years old as a proxy to pregnancy weight, and gestational diabetes, hypertension, as well as maternal smoking when pregnant. So let's look at the results. You have on your left table 1, which is characteristics of the participant. And you can see that it was pretty much half-half boys and girls, with 54% of the participants being males. 80% of them were ever breastfed in infancy. And then if we look a little bit lower in the characteristics in childhood, you can see that 21% of them were overweight and 25% of them were obese at 8 to 10 years. Then if we simply look at the correlation between weight for length and BMI at the 3 time points, so 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months, we can see that they are both highly correlated with very high correlation coefficients. Then if we look at the association between exposures and outcomes, we can see that weight for length and BMI were associated with all measures of adiposity at 8 to 10 years. However, associations with cardiometabolic outcomes were less consistent, with some items being significant here and there at 6, 12, and 18 months, but no consistency at the 3 time points. So probably more coming from statistical noise from testing so many models. And then if we look at the predictive capability of weight for length and BMI, we can see that the eta squared were highly similar for both weight for length and BMI. They were actually moderate for adiposity measures, but low for cardiometabolic outcomes at 8 to 10 years of age. And then if we look at the agreement of predictions between both our measures and cardiometabolic outcomes in late childhood, we see that the Linz coefficient were very good to excellent for all outcomes, so adiposity and cardiometabolic outcomes, suggesting an almost perfect agreement. So that leads us to some key points in conclusion. Weight for length and BMI in infancy are strongly associated with adiposity at 8 to 10 years, but less consistently with other cardiometabolic outcomes. However, both measures appear to be equivalent in predicting these later outcomes. Our findings hence suggest that BMI should be recommended for growth monitoring from 0 to 18 years old, leading to a change in practice, yes, but also to a more harmonious approach to longitudinal growth monitoring using a single growth monitoring tool. So those are my main references, and many acknowledgements, especially the participants of the quality cohort, also Nicholas and Haley for their presentations this morning, and of course, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Baptiste, for presenting your work on a very important pediatric topic. I will ask the judge. I had a drum roll, I would do it, but okay, I don't think I can read that out, John.
I will then. We want a round of applause for our moderator who did an amazing job.
Awesome job, Lucy. Thank you
And I'll do the drum roll.
There's a drum roll. Okay. Thank you very much, folks. That was very kind. And I was actually going to read that out loud and thought, nope, not happening. So before we go to the awards, would you like to, John, announce the awardees? I don't have a list here.
Well, first I'll say that every year it's the same. It's our 32nd year doing this. And for those that aren't aware, we do have all the winners on our website. So I'll put that in the chat in a minute. And thank you so much for contributing to this virtual one. The first time we've done a virtual one, it's been a really awesome week. And again, as every year, it was down to margin. So really, really tight. And I'm going to hand it over to Catherine, Dr. Pound, who will announce the winners.
Okay, thank you, John. So I want to reiterate what Dr. McGevick said. It was a very, very tough decision. All the presentations were fantastic. I'm always impressed to see what you guys are doing from a research perspective. It's amazing given that the clinical work, and especially this year with the pandemic, and it's just been a crazy year. So anyways, huge congratulations to everyone. Again, my drum roll. So in third position, we have Nicholas. So congratulations.
Congratulations.
Sending that out to you.
In second position, we have Jean-Baptiste. So again, congratulations. And I guess there's no suspense now since there were only 3 people, but in first position, we have Haley. So congratulations again to everyone. It was a wonderful hour, very interesting, and looking forward to next year.
Yes, and Andrea was showing off the medals that my CERN will be mailing out to you. So we'll need your addresses. Yep,
I've got. Thank you so much, guys.
And you can wear those around your neck when you get them for the week, and take some selfies and put them up on Twitter.
Yeah,
and
please do.
Send them to us. We'll post them on the website.
Yeah.
But thanks everyone for your work, your attendance. Thanks to the judges, and again, thanks to Andrea and Christine for all their work on this. It's been a wonderful week. I've enjoyed myself thoroughly, and I can say that the majority of the judges and John, you probably feel the same as well. So congratulations to everyone for your fantastic work. You and your institutions and your supervisors should be very proud of you. Thanks again.
Thank you very much,
everybody.
Okay.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Take care.
Take care.